At 9:27 in the morning on December 13th, 1943, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair pulled his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk into a climbing turn over Assam, India, and saw something through the morning haze that stopped his breath. 64 Japanese aircraft, 3 miles east, heading directly for his base at Denjon Airfield. Adair was 23 years old. He had already flown 43 combat missions with the 89th Fighter Squadron, protecting the Hump Airlift, the legendary and brutally dangerous supply route that American pilots flew over the Himalayas into China. He knew what a Japanese raid looked like. He understood exactly what was coming, and he was the only American pilot in the air. The formation bearing down on him was not a probe or a patrol. It was a full strike package. 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers arranged in tight V formations are escorted by approximately 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters layered above and below the bomber stream. A coordinated, professional attack, exactly the kind that had been systematically destroying Allied airfields across northeast India for the past 2 months. In the previous 8 weeks alone, similar Japanese raids had destroyed 47 transport aircraft on the ground and killed 112 Allied personnel. Intelligence reports were unambiguous about what raids of this size did to undefended airfields. 90% hit rates, total destruction, and Denjon Airfield below him was very much undefended. On the ground sat 14 C-47 transport aircraft, each loaded with critical supplies for Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China. A field hospital was treating 63 wounded soldiers. 11 days' worth of aviation fuel sat in storage, supporting the entire Hump airlift operation. If those bombers reached their release point unopposed, the damage would cripple Allied supply lines over the Himalayas for weeks. The wounded in that field hospital would have no protection. The transport aircraft would burn on the runway. The fuel stocks would go up in a fireball that would be visible for miles. The nearest friendly fighters were 38 minutes away at Jorhat. Adair's P-40, nicknamed Lulu Bell and marked with the number 44, carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns and enough ammunition for approximately 12 seconds of sustained fire. His fuel tanks were full. 180 gallons, about 90 minutes at combat power. The Japanese formation was 3,000 feet below him, closing at 240 miles per hour. Standard doctrine was not ambiguous on this situation. When outnumbered more than 5 to 1, the fighter pilot waits for reinforcements. Adair wasn't outnumbered 5 to 1. He was outnumbered 64 to 1. The doctrine didn't have a section covering those odds because no one had expected anyone to need it. He had 2 choices: radio for help, shadow the formation, and wait. By which time the bombs would already be falling, and the people he was supposed to protect would already be dying. Or attack alone, right now, and try to break up the bombing run before the formation reached the field. Philip Adair pushed the throttle forward. His Allison V-1710 engine responded immediately. Manifold pressure climbing to 54 inches. The P-40 accelerating to 320 miles per hour. He positioned himself 4,000 feet above the bomber formation, approaching from the south with the morning sun directly behind him. The Oscars hadn't spotted him yet, and their attention was focused forward on the target ahead. He had one advantage, and only one: surprise. Japanese pilots expected to meet American fighters near the airfield, not 20 miles out. His plan was simple because it had to be. Hit the lead bombers first. Ignore the fighters initially. Break their formation accuracy. Make them scatter. Force them to abort the run. One P-40 with 12 seconds of ammunition couldn't shoot down 64 aircraft. But one P-40, appearing from the right angle at the right moment, might be able to convince 64 aircraft that the sky over Denjon wasn't safe to fly through. The lead Sally bomber group flew in two tight Vs of 3 aircraft each. Adair rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and dove at the formation from their 7 o'clock high position. His airspeed built rapidly. 360 miles per hour, 380, when the Allison screamed at full power. The bomber crews still hadn't seen him. At 800 yards, he opened fire. His .50 calibers hammered. Tracers arced toward the lead bomber. Rounds walked up the Sally's left wing. Fabric tore, metal sparked. And the port engine erupted in orange flame. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The formation broke instantly. Bombers scattered left and right, their tight V dissolving into chaos. Adair pulled up hard, 7 Gs crushing him down into his seat, and rolled right. 40 Oscar fighters were already diving toward him. Now came the part that the odds said was unsurvivable. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar was one of the most maneuverable fighters in the entire Pacific theater. Powered by a Nakajima engine producing 1,150 horsepower, it could reach 329 miles per hour at 13,000 feet and execute turning circles tighter than any American fighter. Its butterfly combat flaps allowed pilots to bleed speed rapidly in turns without stalling, an advantage that Japanese pilots had spent years learning to exploit with devastating precision. In the previous 6 months alone, Oscars had shot down 63 Allied fighters over Burma and northeast India. Adair's P-40 was faster in a straight line. But in a sustained turning fight, the heavier American aircraft would lose energy faster than the lightweight Japanese fighter, and once it lost energy, it would lose the fight. Standard P-40 tactics against Oscars were drilled into every pilot until they were instinct. Never turn with them. Use speed, hit and run. Extend away. Reset. Keep the engagement on your terms, not theirs. But Adair couldn't extend away. If he fled, the bombers would reform and complete their attack run. He had to keep pressure on that formation. Keep them scattered. Keep them nervous. Keep them thinking that the sky was full of American fighters rather than one American fighter. Even if maintaining that illusion meant fighting 40 Oscars at odds that made the original 64-1 look reasonable. The first 4 Oscars came at him in a finger-4 formation from his 10 o'clock high. He rolled left, pulled the nose up, and fired a 2-second burst at the lead fighter. Rounds missed high. The Oscar broke right, wingman following. Adair reversed, diving away to maintain speed. 2 more Oscars dove from above. He saw them at 400 yards, pulled into a climbing left turn, fired again. No hits. His ammunition counter showed 800 rounds remaining across all 6 guns, approximately 6 more attacks at his current rate of fire. Behind the fighter screen, the Sally bombers were attempting to reform. 3 groups of 6 aircraft each were closing back into tight formation. If they achieved their bombing V again, they would press the attack. Adair had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached their release point over Denjon. He rolled out, shoved the throttle to the stop, and dove toward the bombers again. 8 Oscars followed him down. The P-40 accelerated to 405 miles per hour in the dive, a speed the Oscars couldn't match. Adair opened the gap, pulled out at bomber altitude, and lined up on the right-hand Sally formation. Range 300 yards. He fired. Tracers converged on the lead bomber's right engine. The Mitsubishi radial engine exploded in a fireball. The bomber rolled right, streaming fire and debris, its wingman breaking formation to avoid the collision. Adair kicked rudder, skidded left, and fired at another Sally. His rounds punched through the bomber's thin fuselage skin. The Ki-21 had no armor protection for its crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks, design compromises from 1936 that had made it obsolete by 1943, but hadn't made it any less capable of delivering 2,200 pounds of bombs onto everything at Denjon Airfield. The formation broke for the second time. Bombers scattered in 3 directions. Their bombing accuracy was destroyed. Even if they dropped now, their bombs would spread across miles of jungle instead of concentrating on the airfield. He had bought time, but now his engine started warning him that time was something it didn't have much of either. The Allison V1710 was a liquid-cooled engine. At combat power settings above 50 inches of manifold pressure, it generated extreme heat. Coolant circulated through passages in the cylinder heads and block, absorbing that heat, then flowed through a radiator beneath the fuselage to shed it. The system was engineered to handle sustained combat operation at full power for approximately 20 minutes. Adair had been running at full power for 11 minutes. His coolant temperature gauge showed 230 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal operating temperature was 210. At 250, the engine would begin to fail. He had perhaps 9 minutes of full power operation remaining before his only means of staying in the air started coming apart. He had 3 choices: reduce power and let the engine cool, which meant backing off the attack and giving the bombers time to reform; abandon the attack entirely and return to base it while the aircraft still worked; or keep fighting and accept that he might lose his engine over hostile jungle with Japanese patrols on the ground below. The Sally bombers were 17 miles from Denjon, still within bombing range, still a threat to the hospital, the transports, the fuel, the people on the ground who had no idea how close the bombs had come to falling on them. Adair kept the throttle forward. 2 Oscars came at him head-on. Closing speed exceeded 600 miles per hour. Both fighters opened fire at 500 yards. He saw their muzzle flashes, 7.7mm tracers walking toward his nose. He fired back. His heavier .50 caliber rounds carried more energy and reached farther. At 350 yards, his rounds hit the left Oscar's engine cowling. The lightweight fighter shuddered, broke left, trailing white coolant vapor. Its wingman followed the brake. Adair rolled right and dove. His coolant temperature hit 240 degrees. He went for the lead bomber formation again. 6 Oscars tried to intercept. He dove past them at 390 miles per hour, faster than they could follow. At bomber altitude, he leveled out and opened fire on the lead Sally. His burst hit the right wing root. The wing structure failed. The outer panel folded upward and tore away. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin with no recovery. No parachutes came out. The crew rode it all the way down. The formation broke for the 3rd time. Adair pulled up hard. His coolant temperature gauge showed 248 degrees. Then 8 Oscars dove on him from above simultaneously. He saw them late, rolled left, too slow. 7.7mm rounds punched through his right wing, tore fabric, buckled metal. 1 round hit his right aileron control rod. The aileron response went immediately mushy. He needed more right stick pressure just to hold level flight. Another burst walked up his fuselage. Rounds sparked off the engine cowling. 1 penetrated the coolant reservoir behind the firewall. Green coolant sprayed across his windscreen. The coolant temperature gauge climbed past 260 degrees. Steam erupted from the cowling seams. His oil pressure dropped. The Allison engine, which had been fighting to keep itself alive for the past 15 minutes, was losing that fight. Adair chopped the throttle. The engine RPM fell from 3,000 to 2,400. Not enough power to maintain altitude. The P-40 started descending, 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500. The Oscars began circling above him, patient now, waiting. Then his engine caught fire. Fire in a liquid-cooled aircraft engine follows a specific and well-understood sequence. Burning coolant vaporizes and ignites. Flames spread forward along the engine cowling, drawn by the airflow over the aircraft. If the fire reaches the fuel lines running along the engine's left side, the aircraft explodes. Not gradually, but instantly and completely. Adair had perhaps 30 seconds before that happened. Standard procedure for engine fires was not complicated. Shut down the engine immediately. Bail out. The procedure existed because it was the only procedure with a reasonable survival rate. But his altitude was only 8,000 feet, descending rapidly, on over jungle where Japanese ground patrols operated, with 12 miles of hostile territory between him and friendly lines. He kept the engine running. The Allison's fuel mixture could be leaned manually. Adair pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds, starving the engine of fuel, depriving the fire of what it needed to keep burning. The fire intensity decreased. He pushed the mixture forward again. The engine coughed, caught, continued running. Rough now, clearly damaged, producing maybe 60% of its rated power. Not enough to climb. Barely enough to maintain level flight. Not the aircraft he had taken off in that morning, but still flying, still under some form of control. Behind him, the Sally bombers were 13 miles from Denjon, still close enough to turn back and make another attack. But their formations had disintegrated. Individual bombers were heading southeast toward Burma. The coordination that made them dangerous, the tight formations that concentrated their bombs, was gone. The raid was broken. Denjon airfield was safe. Philip Adair turned southwest toward his base at Nguli. 43 miles away, approximately 15 minutes of flight time if the engine kept running. 6 Oscars fell in behind him. At 7,000 feet, his engine oil pressure dropped to 0. Without oil pressure, there was nothing separating the metal surfaces moving inside the engine from each other. Connecting rods ground against the crankshaft. Camshaft lobes pressed dry against lifters. Friction generated heat. Heat caused thermal expansion. Components that were machined to work together within thousandths of an inch of tolerance began closing those gaps. He could feel the vibration increasing through the control stick. The propeller began windmilling unevenly as cylinders started producing inconsistent power. His airspeed dropped to 180 miles per hour. The P-40's stall speed was 120. He was 60 miles per hour away from an uncontrolled descent into jungle from which there would be no recovery. The Oscars behind him closed to 400 yards. They didn't fire. There was no need. They were watching, waiting for the engine to fail completely, waiting for the moment when the American pilot would have to bail out or ride the aircraft down. One Oscar pulled alongside, close enough for Adair to look across the distance between them and see the Japanese pilot's face clearly. The pilot looked at him and gestured downward with one hand. Land the aircraft. Surrender. Become a prisoner of war in 1943 Japanese captivity. An outcome with a survival rate that the history books would later document in considerable detail. Adair ignored him and kept flying. At 6,000 feet, smoke began filling his cockpit. Not from the engine fire this time, from electrical wiring burning behind the instrument panel. The rounds that had walked up his fuselage had severed control cables and damaged the electrical system. Burning insulation produced smoke that was acrid and thick and burned his eyes and throat. He slid the canopy open. Wind blast cleared some of the smoke. But breathing against the slipstream at his airspeed was its own challenge. The Oscars backed off slightly. They had reached a conclusion when the American pilot was already dead. His aircraft was crippled. His engine was dying. he would crash in the jungle. There was no reason to expend ammunition on a man who was going to die without their help. They climbed a little higher and circled, watching him descend. At 4,000 feet, Adair's right aileron control cable snapped completely. The aileron, no longer connected to anything, flopped to full deflection. The P-40 rolled hard right, and the nose dropped into a dive. Adair hauled back on the control stick with both hands. Nothing happened. The elevator cables were damaged from the same burst that had hit his fuselage. He had no pitch control. The nose stayed down, and his airspeed began to build. 200 miles per hour, 220, 250. The jungle was rushing up at him. 3,000 feet, 2,500, 2,000. He was going to crash. Not from enemy action, not from running out of fuel, not from any of the dozen things that had been trying to kill him for the past 20 minutes, but from a control cable that had finally given way at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible location, with no altitude remaining to solve the problem. Then he had an idea. The physics were straightforward, even if no one had ever tried to apply them in quite this way before. The damaged aileron was forcing his right wing down. The broken elevator cables held the horizontal stabilizer in a nose-down position. Together, those two failures were pulling the aircraft into an uncontrolled dive from which it could not recover in normal flight. But aerodynamics are symmetrical. They work the same way regardless of which direction is up. If he rolled the aircraft completely inverted, the damaged aileron that was pushing the right wing down would instead push the right wing up, because up and down would have reversed. The elevator stuck in nose-down trim would push the tail down rather than up, which inverted meant lifting the nose rather than dropping it. Every damaged control surface that was killing him right side up would be working in his favor upside down. The aircraft's failures would become, briefly and theoretically, its solution. At 1,800 feet above the jungle, with maybe 4 seconds before the dive became unrecoverable, Philip Adair rolled the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk completely inverted. Negative G-forces pressed him hard against his shoulder straps. Blood rushed to his head. His vision turned red around the edges as blood pressure in his skull exceeded what his body was designed to handle in sustained negative G flight. The fuel system, designed to feed the engine under positive G loads, with fuel settling toward the pump inlet, struggled to maintain flow with gravity working the wrong direction. The Allison coughed, sputtered, nearly quit entirely, then caught again, running rough, running damaged, but running. The nose came up. The descent slowed. At 1,200 feet, the P-40 leveled out, flying completely upside down at 140 miles per hour. Adair held the inverted attitude. His airspeed climbed to 160. He was climbing, slowly, 50 feet per minute, which was not impressive under normal circumstances and was extraordinary under these. But climbing. Then the fuel starvation problem returned, and the engine began cutting out again as the inverted fuel flow failed to keep up with demand. He rolled right side up. The damaged controls immediately pushed the nose down. The P-40 descended at 600 feet per minute. He waited until he had lost 300 feet, then rolled inverted again. The nose came up. He climbed 200 feet before fuel starvation forced him to roll upright once more. The pattern repeated itself. Inverted to climb. Right side up to let fuel feed properly. Flip, climb, flip, descend. Flip, climb. The 6 Oscars circling above him watched this display in what must have been genuine disbelief. An American P-40 with a burning engine, 0 oil pressure, and control surfaces that no longer worked correctly, flying alternately inverted and upright, refusing by pure mechanical stubbornness and pilot determination to crash, clawing for altitude 200 feet at a time with the persistence of something that simply had not been informed it was supposed to be dead. One Oscar dove to investigate more closely. Adair saw him coming, rolled inverted to gain whatever altitude the maneuver could give him, then rolled upright directly at the approaching Japanese fighter. The Oscar broke away sharply. The American pilot was either insane or desperate, and either way, getting closer to him seemed unwise. The Oscars turned east toward Burma. They were done watching. Adair continued his rolling climb toward Naguli alone. His fuel gauge showed 83 gallons remaining. His oil pressure gauge showed 0 and had for 9 minutes. By every principle of mechanical engineering, the engine should have seized by now. Connecting rods should have welded themselves to the crankshaft through heat and friction. The fact that the Allison was still producing any power at all was not something that the textbooks on engine maintenance would have predicted. It was running on momentum, on friction, and on whatever microscopic film of oil had managed to survive on its internal surfaces long past the point when it should have been gone. Naguli Airfield appeared ahead at 5,000 feet. The runway, the tower, the revetments, safety in the specific and immediate sense of a place where an aircraft could be put on the ground with people nearby who could pull the pilot out if the aircraft caught fire upon landing, which at this point seemed like a reasonable thing to plan for. But he now had a new problem to solve before any of that was possible. His landing gear was hydraulic. The system required engine-driven pump pressure to operate. His engine was producing minimal power and could quit entirely at any moment. If he lowered the gear and then the engine died before he reached the runway, he would crash short with the gear extended. The worst possible configuration for a forced landing on unprepared ground. If he kept the gear retracted and attempted a belly landing, the impact could rupture his remaining fuel tanks, and a ruptured fuel tank on an aircraft that was already on fire was not a survivable outcome. He needed the gear down and locked before the engine failed. He reached for the gear lever with his right hand, which was shaking, and not from fear, but from the carbon monoxide that had been accumulating in his cockpit from the burning electrical wiring for the past 14 minutes. He pulled the lever. Nothing happened. Insufficient hydraulic pressure from the failing engine to actuate the gear. The P-40 had a backup system, a manual hand pump mounted on the left side of the cockpit. 28 strokes of the pump handle would manually pressurize the hydraulic system enough to lower the landing gear. It was a simple system, reliable, designed for exactly this situation. It required both hands to operate effectively. Releasing the control stick with his right hand meant losing aircraft control. With his damaged aileron and elevator, the aircraft would immediately pitch nose down the moment he let go of the stick. Adair reached behind his seat, found his lap belt. Pulled it free, wrapped it around the control stick, looped it through the seat frame, and pulled it tight. The makeshift restraint held the stick in approximate neutral position. Not precise enough for maneuvering, but sufficient to keep the aircraft flying in a rough straight line for the few seconds he needed. He grabbed the hand pump with both hands and worked it hard. 5 strokes, 10, 15. At stroke 23, he felt resistance building, hydraulic pressure accumulating in the lines. At stroke 28, he heard a solid thud from beneath the cockpit floor. Left main gear extended and locked. Right main gear followed 3 seconds later. His airspeed dropped immediately from 160 miles per hour to 135 as the extended gear added drag. Still above stall speed, but not by a margin that allowed for any mistakes. The engine, now producing perhaps 40% of its rated power, was barely keeping the draggy, damaged aircraft in the air. Nagali runway was 7 miles ahead. 3 minutes. His vision began to tunnel. Gray edges closing in from the periphery as carbon monoxide continued accumulating in his blood, binding to hemoglobin that should have been carrying oxygen, starving his brain of what it needed to keep functioning. He shook his head and focused on the runway. 6 miles. 5 miles. The flaps were hydraulic too. With what remained of his engine power already committed to keeping the aircraft airborne, he had nothing left to operate them. Landing without flaps meant touching down at 120 miles per hour instead of 90, faster, using more runway, with less margin for error at the moment of touchdown. At 2 miles from the runway, the engine quit, and the propeller windmilled to a stop. No power, no thrust. The P-40 became a glider, and not a particularly good one. In normal condition, the Warhawk glided at approximately 8-to-1, meaning 8 feet of forward distance for every foot of altitude lost. From 2,000 feet of altitude, that would get him to a point roughly 3 miles ahead, far enough to reach the runway, with some margin remaining. But his aircraft was not in normal condition. 27 bullet holes across the wings and fuselage disrupted the airflow that generated lift and reduced drag. His actual glide ratio in his current state was closer to 6-to-1. At 6-to-1 from 2,000 feet, he could glide approximately 2.25 miles. The runway was 2 miles away. The math didn't quite work. He might make it. Although he might fall short by 100 yards and hit the ground just before the threshold, after surviving everything else that had tried to kill him that morning. Then he remembered something from flight training, something an instructor had mentioned almost in passing, as a theoretical curiosity rather than a practical technique. Something about inverted flight and glide performance. In a normal glide, the wings, curved more on the top surface than the bottom, generate lift upward against gravity while the aircraft descends. The wing's shape is designed to do this efficiently. But inverted, the camber works in reverse. The lift generated points downward. However, at certain angles of attack in inverted flight, the overall aerodynamic drag of the aircraft is actually lower than in normal flight, meaning the aircraft travels farther through the air for each foot of altitude it loses. The inverted glide ratio is, in specific conditions, better than the right side-up glide ratio. No flight instructor had ever expected any student to actually need this information in a practical situation. Adair had nothing to lose and no other options. At 1,800 feet, 1 mile from the runway, he rolled the P-40 inverted for the last time. Blood rushed to his head. His vision went red at the edges. The landing gear, extended and locked, was now subjected to aerodynamic loads from the wrong direction. The gear doors designed to handle air pressure from below were being pushed from above. The gear held. Even the P-40 continued its inverted approach toward the runway threshold. On the ground, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez was watching through binoculars. He saw an inverted P-40 approaching the airfield with its landing gear extended, trailing smoke from the engine compartment. His immediate conclusion was that a Japanese pilot had somehow obtained an American aircraft and was setting up a strafing run on the field. Martinez ran to the nearest .50 caliber machine gun position. 3 other ground crew followed him. They reached the gun emplacement and began traversing the weapon toward the approaching aircraft. Adair was at 400 feet altitude, half a mile from the runway threshold, still inverted. His vision was failing. Carbon monoxide and negative G-forces were working together to shut down his brain. He estimated he had perhaps 20 seconds of useful consciousness remaining. He needed to roll upright, align with the runway, and land. If he rolled too early, the damage controls would push the nose down and he would crash short. If he rolled too late, he would overshoot and there would be no second attempt. At 200 feet altitude, 300 yards from the threshold, he rolled right side up. The damaged aileron immediately pushed the right wing down. He fought it with left stick, forcing the wings level through pure muscle. The nose wanted to drop. He hauled back on the elevator with what partial control remained in the damaged cables. Not much, just enough to keep the nose from going completely under. The P-40 descended toward the runway at a steep angle. Nose high, wings wobbling, smoke pouring from the cowling, gear extended, no power, no flaps, 120 miles per hour. Martinez's gun crew tracked the aircraft in. It was clearly damaged. Smoke, erratic flight, wrong approach angle. It might be friendly. It might be enemy. In 3 seconds, it would cross the runway threshold, and they would know by what it did next. Martinez looked at the damage pattern, the American markings half obscured by smoke and battle damage. The P-40 shape he had been maintaining and repairing for months. He held fire. Adair crossed the threshold at 90 feet altitude, descending fast. Too fast. Too steep. The P-40 dropped the last 90 feet in approximately 4 seconds. The main wheels hit the concrete runway at an impact force the landing gear was not designed to absorb. The struts compressed fully. The tail wheel slammed down. Metal shrieked against concrete. The right main gear, which had been hit by gunfire and manually extended and had absorbed the aerodynamic stress of inverted flight with gear doors loaded the wrong way, collapsed on impact. The right wing dropped. The wingtip hit the runway surface and dug in. The aircraft ground-looped hard right, spinning 180 degrees, throwing sparks and fragments of concrete across the runway surface in a wide arc, and skidded backward 200 feet before it stopped moving. Smoke billowed from the engine compartment. Fire crews were already running. Philip Adair sat motionless in the cockpit for 12 seconds. Then he released his shoulder straps, stood up in the seat, and climbed out onto the wing. His legs buckled when he tried to stand on the wing's surface. He caught himself on the wing root. Ground crew reached him and steadied him and helped him down. When Martinez and the fire crew opened the cowling, what they found inside the Allison engine was not so much a damaged power plant as a record of everything it had done after it should have stopped. Pistons seized in their cylinders. Crankshaft warped from heat beyond what the metal should have tolerated. Oil pan ruptured. 3 connecting rods welded to the crankshaft by heat and friction that had nowhere else to go. Every cylinder showed scoring damage from metal-on-metal contact after the oil was gone. The coolant system was completely destroyed, every line either punctured by gunfire or burned through by the temperatures the engine had reached. They walked around the aircraft and counted. 16 bullet holes in the fuselage. 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left. 1 round had severed the right aileron control cable completely. Another had punctured the hydraulic reservoir. A third had cut through 2 electrical bundles behind the instrument panel. The aircraft that had once been Lulu Bell was not going to be repaired and returned to service. It was going to be documented, stripped of anything usable, and scrapped. But the pilot was standing on the flight line, shaking slightly, being helped by ground crew, alive. 3 days later, 10th Air Force Headquarters interviewed Adair about the engagement. He described the attack sequence, the inverted flying technique, the approach and landing. Flight surgeons examined him. They found that carbon monoxide levels in his blood were still measurably elevated 72 hours after the mission. Based on the levels they recorded and the rate at which the body clears carbon monoxide, they calculated that he had been flying with severe carbon monoxide poisoning for the final 11 minutes of flight. The impairment level they calculated was sufficient, under normal circumstances, to render a person unconscious. Philip Adair had remained functional through the gear emergency, the inverted approach, and the landing, all of it, on will alone. Intelligence reports confirmed what his 20 minutes in the air had accomplished. All 24 Sally bombers had turned back without releasing a single bomb over Allied territory. The Japanese formation had scattered 15 miles short of their target. 40 Oscar fighters had escorted empty bombers back to Burma with nothing accomplished. 0 bombs hit Allied facilities at Denjan. 0 casualties among the ground personnel. On all 14 C-47 transports remained operational and continued flying the hump. The field hospital continued treating the 63 wounded soldiers inside it. The fuel stocks that supported 11 days of airlift operations remained intact. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commander of United States forces in the China-Burma-India theater, presented Second Lieutenant Philip Adair with the Silver Star. The citation described gallantry in action on December 13, 1943, when Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft attacking Allied installations, continuing his attack despite severe aircraft damage and personal injury, thereby preventing the destruction of critical supply facilities. Adair went back to flying. He flew 95 more combat missions with the 81st Fighter Group, and he achieved ace status with 5 confirmed aerial kills. On his final combat mission in July 1944, he shot down 2 P-43 Oscars over northern Burma, the same type of aircraft that had followed him home that December morning, waiting for him to die. He returned to the United States in September 1944, survived the war, and remained in the Air Force for 30 years, retiring as a full colonel in 1971. The 81st Fighter Group, known as the Burma Banshees, their aircraft marked with a death's head skull insignia that became one of the most recognized markings in the China-Burma-India theater, flew combat operations until August 1945. They destroyed 413 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and 147 more on the ground. They lost 63 pilots killed or missing. They flew in an obscure theater of a vast war, protecting a supply route that most people had never heard of, keeping alive a connection between Allied forces and Chinese resistance that the supply planners said was essential, and the pilots who flew it confirmed was extremely dangerous. The P-40 Warhawk never achieved the reputation of the aircraft that replaced it. It was slower than the P-51 Mustang. It couldn't fight effectively above 15,000 feet. By 1943, it was already being called obsolete by the people who made decisions about such things. It didn't have the range or the altitude performance or the top-end speed that made later American fighters into legends. It was a capable aircraft from an earlier moment in the war, being flown past the point where it was the right tool for the job, by pilots who flew it anyway, because it was what they had. But on December 13, 1943, Maastricht in the hands of a 23-year-old second lieutenant who had made a particular decision about what to do when the odds were 64-1 and no one else was available, an obsolete P-40 held off an entire Japanese strike package. Took everything that strike package could deliver in return. Flew home inverted on a burning engine with no oil pressure and no working controls, and landed, in the loosest possible sense of the word, at a friendly airfield with its pilot inside it. The impossible odds meant nothing, because the pilot flying inside them had decided they didn't.